Again, my name is John Hood. I'm the president of the Pope Foundation. I am moderating these panels this afternoon because moderating the panels does not require knowing much of anything. So that's my qualification. I do want to talk about the people who are qualified to talk about this set of topics, which is terrorism and security. And our speakers today, I'm going to again introduce them in the order that they will provide some opening remarks. And I'll start with Ambassador Jim Cain. He's a partner in Cain Global Partners. His career has spanned the fields of law, business, sports, and international diplomacy. From July of 2005 to January of 2009, Jim served as U.S. Ambassador to the Kingdom of Denmark. Prior to his diplomatic service, he had served as President and Chief Operating Officer of the Carolina Hurricanes of the NHL and as a partner in the international law firm of Kilpatrick, Townsend, and Stockton, and as founder and chairman of numerous civic and business enterprises. Upon leaving his diplomatic post, Ambassador Cain began working with North American and European consumer brand companies to expand their operations into the surging markets of Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. Jim did his undergraduate work and earned his law degree at Wake Forest University, and he and his wife Helen divide their time between North Carolina and New York City. Our next speaker will be Representative Mark Walker from the 6th District of North Carolina. After serving almost 2 decades as a pastor, Mark Walker followed a new calling and launched an improbable but successful campaign to represent the people of North Carolina in Congress. In the 115th Congress, Walker was elected by his colleagues to serve as chairman of the Republican Study Committee, the largest conservative caucus of House Republicans, and a leading influencer on policy since 1973. Congressman Walker is also co-chair of the Congressional Prayer Caucus, which works successfully to promote efforts that protect the free exercise of religion for all Americans. He's a member of the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee, the House Committee on Homeland Security, and the Committee on House Administration. He is a native of Florida, but saw better of things and moved appropriately northward. But as far north as you should ever move, of course. Exactly. He has called the Piedmont Triad home for almost 3 decades and lives in Greensboro with his wife, Kelly, and his 3 children. Our other speaker is Robert Wilkie, Senior Advisor to Senator Thom Tillis. Previously, Wilkie served as Assistant Secretary of Defense under Robert Gates and Donald Rumsfeld. He also served as Special Assistant to President George W. Bush for National Security Affairs and as Senior Director of the National Security Council under Dr. Condoleezza Rice. He is a reserve officer assigned to the headquarters of the United States Air Force. Prior to joining the Air Force, Wilkie served in the United States Navy Reserve with Naval Special Warfare Group 2 and the Office of Naval Intelligence. He is a graduate of the College of Naval Command and Staff, Air Command and Staff College, and the United States War College, and the Joint Forces Staff College. He's the recipient of the Defense Distinguished Public Service Medal, which is the highest civilian medal in the department. He's a native of Fayetteville. He has his law degree from Loyola University of New Orleans, his master's from Georgetown, another master's in strategic studies from the War College, and an honors degree in politics from Wake Forest University. So the Demon Deacons are well represented this afternoon. And with that, let's begin with some opening remarks from our panelists, starting with Ambassador Cain.
Thank you, John. It's an honor to be here, Congressman, with you and my old friend Robert Wilkie from years ago. This topic of terrorism is one that's very personal to me, and it's one that I haven't spoken about in public, with the exception of testifying in Parliament in Belgium on the 22nd of last month. Exactly 1 year prior to that, on the morning of the 21st of March 2016, I was in the Raleigh-Durham Airport flying to New York City. Taking an early flight and was in conversation with my friend Bob Bonzak. You might know Bob from Chapel Hill. I saw a text from my daughter and didn't respond because I was talking to Bob. And then my phone rang. I didn't answer it till I excused myself from Bob and looked down at my text, and it was from my daughter. She said she was living in New York, and she said Alex, her boyfriend of 4.5 years, says Alex was on the flight in Brussels. I didn't know what she was talking about. It dawned on me that as I'd walked by the 42nd Street Oyster Bar there at the airport, I had seen a television monitor in the background with something about an explosion in Brussels. And so I picked up the phone, called Cameron, and she said, Dad, Alex and Sasha, Alex's sister, were at the airport in Brussels at the Delta ticket line. We're on the phone with their mother when the phone went dead, and I can't reach them. So I frantically started making phone calls, reaching out to whomever I could, couldn't learn anything, flew to New York, landed in New York, had a call from a friend of mine who said that there's a guy from Raleigh being interviewed on CNN about the Brussels airport terrorist attack. And his name is Mark Noel. You might know Mark Noel. He formed a company called Nomacor here in Raleigh. So I know Mark. I called Mark. Mark was outside of the airport. He'd been in the airport when the blast went off. I said, Mark, this is Jim Kane. He said, Jim, thank you so much for calling. Oh, I'm so blessed. I'm such a lucky man. I don't know why I was saved. I said, Mark, hold on one second. My daughter's boyfriend and his sister were in the Delta ticket line. Where were you when the blast went off? He said, they were in the Delta ticket line? I said, yeah. He said, Jim, the news is going to be really bad. So I called my wife and suggested she fly from Raleigh to New York, and went to my daughter's apartment, and we spent the day frantically trying to find Alex and Sasha, trying to call our contacts at the embassy or at the State Department or in Brussels or wherever to seek help finding those two children. Helen got there about 4 o'clock. Media had picked up on the fact that there were 2 kids from New York who were missing among the 30 that were already confirmed dead in the airport and the subway. And they'd figured out that there was a relationship between one of them and the former American ambassador. So there were TV trucks parked outside the apartment on Lower East Side of Manhattan. About 5 o'clock, as we're frantically searching through our contacts, Cameron pulls her mother and me close on the sofa, and she says, I got something to tell you, Mom and Dad. We said, what's that? She said, a year and a half ago, Alex and I were secretly married in New York. We loved Alex. We knew they would eventually get married, but we didn't know they had been married. But what that meant was, instead of searching for a boyfriend, we were searching for a son-in-law and a husband. So we called our friends at Delta, and they helped us get on an immediate flight, flew to Brussels, and we spent a day and a half searching the hospitals of Brussels for Alex and Sasha. I think words don't describe adequately how horrible that experience was. We were ushered through the different hospitals. I'd called my friend Jim Reese, former head of Delta Force, who runs a company called Tiger Swan here in Raleigh, to send us support, both security and resources to help us in our search. I'd reached out to the U.S. Embassy, of course, and other assets. We spent a day in the military hospital in Belgium trying to find our children. The whole world thinking, by the way, that it was a boyfriend, because my wife said, look, she said to Cameron, you cannot tell anybody that you're married to Alex until you tell your grandfather and grandmother and your sister. And we didn't want to call them until we knew the fate of Alex and Sasha. So for a day in the horrible, hot basement of that hospital, we conducted a search for the kids with an abysmal lack of what you might call customer service. There were 20 families huddled down there looking for their loved ones from 17 different countries and at least a dozen different languages. No counseling, no therapy, no support for our daughter. About 4 o'clock, a woman came in and said, told my wife. She said, there are 4 victims in this hospital who we can't identify. And my wife said, well, let us see them. Let us find them. And the nurse said, oh, no, the special prosecutor has jurisdiction and won't let anybody see the victims. And like, what do you mean? Any mother will know her child regardless of what condition they're in. Wouldn't let us see them. So I started calling anybody I could think of, including the king and queen, to try to force the special prosecutor to let these parents visit the unidentified victims. That didn't seem to help, so we went to the media, and there were cameras parked out front of the hospital, so Helen and I went to the hospital cameras in the front and had an impromptu press conference, which made some difference. It went viral on CNN and Sky News. And pretty soon there was a lot of activity at the hospital, including more security to watch out for whatever we did next. About 7 o'clock, officials came in and said they had now identified all victims who were still alive, and they produced a list. And they said, if your loved one's name is not on this list, you can presume they're dead. It was that compassionate. So they put the list on a desk in the corner of the room. Helen ran to it, and after checking twice, didn't see Alex and Sasha's names. The evolving scene reminded me of what I remember reading in Dante's Inferno. The anguish in that room was beyond description. But we left and went back to the hotel, and Cameron then called her grandparents and her sister, told them that we knew that Alex and Sasha were dead, and of course informed them that she had married Alex several months earlier. The next morning, the Dutch ambassador came in, and the Pinchovskis were Dutch, and confirmed that the remains had been identified. So Cameron and her mother-in-law went to identify Alex and Sasha at the morgue. And we now know that, we knew later maybe that they had been killed in the first blast, and in fact that their identities were known to the first responders within an hour or two of the blast. So before we ever even left New York to fly to Brussels, the first responders knew that they'd been killed, but the bureaucracy of Belgium didn't allow them to tell anybody. So in the days following, as I searched, as you would expect, for purpose and meaning in that unimaginable experience, and as I continue to search for meaning and purpose in that experience, there are a couple of messages that I dwell on, and I'll just throw them out, John, and we can talk about them later or not, and I'll do this as quickly as I can. But one is that in this fight, and this was an ISIS cell that blew these bombs up, killed my son-in-law. In this fight against ISIS, against terror, the world has to get serious about it, and America has to lead. We now know that these 4 ISIS terrorists who killed themselves and my children in the airport were known to our intelligence services. They were part of the Paris cell that had blown up the bombs in Paris in November. We knew who they were. We knew where they were. The Turks knew where they were. The Israelis knew where they were. We'd shared that information with the Belgian authorities. Belgium ignored it. We had advised Belgium that something serious was going to happen, but because of the Belgian privacy laws, which are similar, by the way, to a lot of European laws, Belgian police can't be forced to work on the weekend. So they waited until Monday to raid the apartments where these terrorists were building their bombs, and by that point the terrorists had moved the bombs to a warehouse, and the explosions took place on Tuesday morning. So it became obvious to us that this dysfunctionality of and lack of coordination and sharing of intelligence services was a real problem, and there are many other problems. I wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal a couple weeks after that, early April, calling Belgium the closest thing to a failed state in Europe, and comparing the world's coming together after 9/11 with the fact that in 9/11 there were around 3,000 people killed in America. There have been more people killed than that in the West by terrorist acts since 9/11. And I question whether the world had the willpower to to collaborate and fight this ISIS terrorist threat in a serious way, and whether America had the willpower, quite frankly, to lead. And this was in April of the Obama administration's last year, and I was convinced that we didn't have the willpower to lead, and I called out NATO in this op-ed to reinvoke Article 5. I called out the White House, or whoever might succeed President Obama, to get serious about this threat. I had a call the next day from Anders Fogh Rasmussen, my old friend, the former Danish prime minister who had become NATO's Secretary General, and he said, you're exactly right. He said, Belgium is a failed state, and NATO should have taken the lead in making sure we had security covered long before now. Within about 2 weeks, the Trump administration pivoted and said, okay, NATO has to get serious about security and terrorism, and they are now. But my first point is that the Western world has to get serious about this threat, and America has to lead. My second point is, to fight this threat effectively, we have to disable the social media network that's built and owned by America that these terrorists operate on. And Congressman, I'm glad that you're here to hear this. We know that the terror plots in Paris and Brussels, including those that killed Alex and Sasha, were planned and plotted and funded and recruited and carried out by ISIS exclusively using Twitter. It's ironic. ISIS uses Twitter, Facebook, Al-Qaeda uses Facebook. 40,000 active ISIS-related sites on Twitter operating in 2016. Congressman Ted Poe, for about 12 months, had been trying to convince the FBI to shut down Twitter's terrorist communication platform. One of your colleagues testified on the floor of the House a week before the Brussels blast, so between Paris and Brussels, testified that there were 12,000 active ISIS-related threats in Europe coming through Twitter, and wondering why in the world we can't stop them. Twitter responds, and this is an article in Mother Jones magazine, which was a fascinating article, responds that, well, we can't infringe on free speech because one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. The U.S. Anti-Terrorism Act prohibits any American entity, company or otherwise, from doing anything to support or provide platform for terrorists. So there's no action coming out of Washington at the time. So I'm proud to say that my daughter, in February of this year, became the lead plaintiff in a lawsuit in New York City against Twitter, Cain versus Twitter, to shut down this terrorist platform that gives ISIS and its henchmen a way to plot, plan, and execute their global strategy. It's a 125-page, 666-count complaint that catalogs the historical rise of ISIS and their use of Twitter and Twitter's refusal, in spite of evidence provided by our FBI, refusal to shut that down. And Congressman, I hope that Washington will support this effort, and I hope that the courts of America will not be intimidated by Twitter's limitless resources. My final point is that America needs to support its victims of terrorism wherever they are. The morning of Friday the 25th, when Cameron was visiting her husband in the morgue, John Kerry was laying flowers at the airport about a mile away. Our daughter never heard from John Kerry. She never heard from anybody with the administration or the State Department. There's no program in America to support American victims of foreign, really, or domestic terrorism. We had a great program after 9/11, very generous support for all victims, regardless of whether they're American or Cuban or Belgian, and there were Belgian and Cuban victims in 9/11. But there's no program in America. In fact, there are not many programs anywhere. We got a letter in January of this year from the King and Queen and Prime Minister saying they were proud to announce a program in Belgium to support victims if you were a resident or citizen of Belgium. That didn't make me very happy, so I dashed off a letter to the King, which got printed in the media over there. We were invited to testify in Parliament on the 21st, which is why we were there for that testimony. and I'm hopeful that it will do some good. The UK has a terrific program. We met a lady named Suzanne Sutcliffe, whose husband had been killed in the Brussels metro attack. She's a UK citizen. Her husband was also Dutch. The UK provides a team of people who are there to help victims wherever they are in the world. It's a good program. So, Congressman, those last 2 points in particular I share with you in hopes that perhaps you'll carry those messages back to Washington. But thank you for the chance to share that personal story, and thanks for the chance to visit with you today.
Thank you, Jim. That was very difficult, we could tell, for you to say, and difficult for us to hear, but really important as setting the stage for our conversation. Congressman?
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I won't even begin to pretend that I can either follow from certainly a personal story, but even the professional experience, Jim, that you've had over the years. We'll share a little bit for a few minutes and hopefully take some questions. But having the opportunity to be up here, certainly with Ambassador Cain, but also Mr. Wilkie, as far as the vast experience, is certainly a privilege. I'll speak a little bit as far as some of our time overseas and serving as a pastor and working in refugee camps. In fact, it's interesting. We've talked so much about Brussels, Belgium today. Back in June of 2000, we took 200 people, split them in groups of 20, and worked in 10 different refugee camps throughout the country of Belgium several years ago. And that was kind of the beginning of my journey to be able to see some of the things that were going on internationally and some of the concerns that began to grow. Have served the first 2 years. I served on the Committee on Homeland Security. Obviously, that was quite an education, eye-opening. I remember the first major impact, and some of you may remember this as well, was the beheading of 21 Egyptian Coptic Christians. In fact, to this day, I spoke on that on the House floor, and of all the different speeches and things, it's the most viewed. We heard from many people out of Egypt, hopefully bringing more attention of what was going on. In fact, speaking of terrorism and even speaking of what's going on with ISIS, last year, 2016, was the #1 year when it comes to people of faith being persecuted, primarily by ISIS. ISIS was responsible over 30% of what we know of is 90,000 deaths throughout the world. Again, a third of those by ISIS. You say, why is that important? Well, these guys are getting more and more networked, and they are using Twitter and Facebook, and I'll touch on that a little bit more in just a moment. Becoming more and more network, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, these guys know, they communicate. You might remember the story out of North Africa where a lot of those young girls were kidnapped and captured. They were working directly with ISIS. We have evidence, even support now. They're connecting with drug cartels. We were the first new member to pass legislation on human trafficking. North Carolina is now number 8 in the country in human trafficking. And a lot of it can be traced all the way back to terroristic groups. We're seeing that. Maybe even some of you saw this past week that outside of Syria, Mexico, with its 23,000 murders, is number 2 in the world when it comes to terrorist deaths. Think about that, and we'll talk some about border security and why that is so important of what is happening just below our southern border. Those things are important. Also want to spend some time, and if we have it, talking about NATO. You've heard our president talk a little bit about NATO. In fact, last year, we were in the country of Georgia, I believe it is, or Lithuania. We spent some time there, as well as Romania, when there was a little bit of brouhaha. And as you know, if Mr. Trump says anything, the press will take it with much exaggeration and, shall I say, even fabrication at times, I've realized. But the point is that he has called out and brought some attention to some items and some topics of discussion that we need to have. For example, of the 28 countries in NATO, which I believe is certainly something that it's important for us to be involved with. It's been around since 1949. But the U.S. Has been contributing, I think, last year, $664 billion to NATO. The vast majority, and they use a little mathematics statistic called the gross national income. And that's not to say or disparage other countries, but you have 5 countries that were paying less than 1%, while the United States was paying the bulk of that. Those are the kinds of things that we need to be talking about in a 21st century where terrorism and global security is part of really of our daily dialogue. Spent some time on the border there of North and South Korea. One of the more fascinating places I've ever been in my life as we looked out and even crossed over to a little bit of North Korea. But I was amazed, and I was with 7 or 8 other members of Congress, and as we were getting off the bus there on the border, they said, "Now remember, please make no sudden movements, do not point to anything, just kind of remain in place." And as the North Korean soldiers literally came up between here and this wall, but the distance there, I was impressed in the scene of what these North Korean soldiers look like, malnourished. Their uniforms literally just draped on them. And as we looked at some surveillance, most of the North Korean landscape, which was forestry at one time, has all been mowed down except for 2 or 3 places where they've got the nuclear reactors that are working constantly, and we don't know the full depth of that. But we have a place in our time where your children and grandchildren are facing more and more potential threats across the world when it comes to security and when it comes to the vast growing of terrorism. As Ambassador Cain mentioned, it's almost politically incorrect to speak in terms of harshness to be able to call out who the real enemy is. And I will close with this little bit of idea. I want to continue to talk about the international terrorism, but I also want to discuss domestic terrorism. You see, sometimes even in Homeland Security, to get something that you and I would be very simple, very easy to understand, can be very difficult because of the terminology of being sexist, racist, etc. You're putting too much dollars in fighting the foreign fighters, that we need to be fighting these right-wing extremists as well. The problem is that there's never really any proof. But one specific story, and I'll close with this, that I found very interesting, that it's important to remember how radical the left is, to use their terminology. You may have heard of the Southern Poverty Law Center. One particular hearing, the president there was testifying and specifically pushed back as he began to talk about some of the right-wing extreme groups. A story didn't really make the headlines because a lot of lives were saved when a gentleman showed up one day at the headquarters of the Family Research Council. He had 2 bags of Chick-fil-A sandwiches and an assault weapon where he was determined to kill the 9 employees there that day on the Family Research Council. On his way to the elevator, he was intercepted by a security guard. Shots were exchanged, and the security guard killed the terrorist. Why is that important? Well, as I pointed out to the president of the Southern Poverty Law Center, in the gentleman's clothes, he had a piece of paper. And on that piece of paper was a printout from the website of Southern Poverty Law Center listing the Family Research Council as a hate group. So he was going to go take care of this hate group. So as we talk about terrorism and domestic today, remember that these extremists on the left that are in our country every day that would love to define us as a right-wing or a terrorist group in our own behavior just because we aspire to tell the truth and be able to point out who our true enemy is. It's a privilege with you today. You mentioned the Wake Forest Baptist connection. My wife is a family nurse practitioner at Wake Forest Baptist Medical Center, so got 2 bookend grads, and maybe a little wife gives me props. Anyway, it's a privilege. We look forward to some of your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Before I start, I always like to bring a Helms event back to the progenitor of the feast. I think my greatest honor in political life has been to have served for someone that I grew up watching on television. And in my confirmation hearing, the first thing I said was that the only sad part of this occasion was that Jesse Helms was not here to see it. And in discussing the subject of terrorism, I'm going to go back to something that, a discussion that I had on my very first day as an intern with Senator Helms. And I say this because Nancy is sitting here and Mike is sitting here. And he was reading my Wake Forest resume, and he looked on it. Now, John said I majored in politics. That was one of 2. The first one was classical languages. Senator Helms looked at that and he said, "Son, that's quite a resume. You are qualified to be a tour guide in Rome and have very long conversations with 90-year-old priests." But then he got serious. And he said, I want to talk to you about something that I consider sacred. He said, what do you know about the phrase, Civis Romanus sum? Well, I made the mistake of giving him the Catholic answer first. I said, Cicero, in his defense of Verres, before a tribune of Roman judges, and Cicero said that the highest honor in the world is to be called a Roman citizen. It said, Senator Helms looked at me and said, let me give you the Protestant answer. I said, well, before you do that, it's in the Acts of the Apostles, I know that. And the Apostle Paul was being tried or condemned for being a heretic and for blaspheming the character of Nero. And he said, I'm a Roman citizen. The trial stopped. As a Roman citizen, he was entitled to be brought before Caesar. Now, the second part of this goes, and Senator Helms was really testing me, and I think I passed the test. He said, is there anything else that goes with that? I said, yes, sir. In 1850, a Portuguese-British Jew named Don Pacifico was thrown into a dungeon in Athens by whatever cabal was in charge of Athens at the time and held hostage. And in a couple of weeks, the word got back to London, and Lord Palmerston stood on the floor of the House of Lords. He was the Prime Minister. And he said, the most important words in the world are Civis Britannicus sum. And within a week, the Royal Navy was off the port of Piraeus, landing Royal Marines in Greece to rescue Don Pacifico. Senator Helms concluded this discussion by saying that the most important secular words that he knew were, I am an American citizen. And it is from that conversation with the senator that I think whatever thoughts I have about terrorism and sovereignty flow. And I'm going to take another step back to my days in Fayetteville. My father was a senior leader of the 82nd Airborne Division, senior commander. And when I was a youngster, in 1979, the hostages were taken in Iran. And I was actually at a high school football game, and there were teachers behind me the day of the attack. And they said, anybody who wants us can have us. And these were in the dark days of Jimmy Carter. And within a week, there was a billboard put on Bragg Boulevard, which we had to pass to go to school every day, that said, Iran, let our people go. And I looked at that and thought about my father and the 82nd Airborne Division, America's most decorated combat unit. And I thought, even as a youngster, that is what we have become under this man from Georgia, that the mighty 82nd Airborne Division is faced with this billboard, and that the only thing we could offer American citizens abroad was, please let our people go. And since that time, we have been in a persistent conflict with Islamic fanaticism. Senator Helms was one of the first to actually see through what was happening in Iran to get to the heart of the matter, that this was a disease that would spread across the Muslim world and eventually threaten the United States, and it was in terms of the Iranian Revolution. But he saw something much broader. And we have been in that persistent conflict since 1979. The Israelis, if you want to go in that direction, have been in it since 1948, or some would say for 5,000 years. And I look at that and I see ups and downs in terms of American responses to what is happening in the world. The last 8 years being the nadir of America's responses. And I say, as a military man in my other life, the notion that Iranian patrols could capture 2 American naval vessels, take hostage United States sailors who were ordered not to fire a shot. And the lieutenant commanding said he did not resist because he was afraid it would hinder the President of the United States' goals of achieving peace with the Ayatollahs. We have come a long way when that is the responses that we are given. And what the ambassador did not say when John Kerry was not responding to the horrors in Belgium. In Belgium, I would argue that de Gaulle was right, that Belgium is a mistake of French foreign policy. While John Kerry was turning a deaf ear, his response to the terrorist attacks in Paris was to send James Taylor to sing "You've Got a Friend" in the Elysee Palace. So where does that leave us? There is no quick solution to this. But retreat in the face of tyranny, regardless of its form, is a prescription for disaster. I think we are beginning to change course. What you have seen in Afghanistan, what you have seen in Syria, the presence of the United States Navy off the coast of North Korea is a signal that I believe is rebounding around the world, that we do have new leadership that will take the fetters off of our combat leaders and respond in a way that brings forward the might of the United States. And so what is the path forward? We first start in South Asia, and President Trump has begun to reverse course in Afghanistan. We sacrificed so much there only to see the previous president pull out and allow Al-Qaeda and even ISIS and the Taliban to return in force. The dropping of that bomb on the Taliban and Al-Qaeda tunnels was a message from our new Secretary of Defense that business as usual is no longer relevant. We also see that there is a renewed hope in the Middle East that the greatest state sponsor of terror, the Ayatollahs in Iran, will be resisted. The Prime Minister of Israel, in a conversation we had in July, was very clear that Mr. Obama did what Moses and all the prophets could not do. He brought Jews and Arabs together because they could no longer count on the United States. So they have come together in the face of a common enemy, and that is Iran, the chief sponsor of Hamas and Hezbollah and dozens of other terror networks throughout the world. Senator Helms made a speech on the Senate floor, I believe in 1987, where he applauded Ronald Reagan's response to the Ayatollahs. The Ayatollahs were harassing ships of the Sixth Fleet stationed in Bahrain, and Ronald Reagan sent one warning through the Swiss. The next warning was the entire Iranian Navy was sunk. Every offshore oil platform in the Persian Gulf was destroyed. And the United States Navy was patrolling in full view of the Iranian coast. And they were choir boys for a number of years after that. Senator Helms recognized that that expression of American power was absolutely vital, long overdue. But he said that it has to be followed up. And of course, the years that followed, it was not. And we disarmed in the face of these growing threats. So what is the answer? I come from the kinetic world. We like putting steel on target, as the tankers say. We have to get back to the notion that the most formidable words in diplomacy are "I am an American citizen," and that those who cross the threshold interfering with that will pay a heavy price. I do believe that President Trump feels that. I know Secretary Mattis does, and Secretary Tillerson does. I was asked by a newspaper to describe Secretary Tillerson. I didn't know anything about his foreign policy, but I do know that Senator Helms taught me that he never met a Texas oil man who wasn't a patriot. But it is going to require a renewed focus on our part. I'll talk really quickly about where we have come in terms of military power in the last 8 years, and I will give you a factoid that I gave General Mattis in the lead up to his confirmation. Under the Obama administration, we lost 100,000 soldiers, but the Department of Defense gained 77,000 union employees. We have to reverse that trend. And once again, and we can talk more about the particulars, but make sure that I am an American citizen is not only an honored phrase, but it is feared by the world's most reprehensible characters.
So I have a question that I think follows well on the comments that all three panelists have made, and particularly falls off or plays off of what Robert Wilkie just said. And it has to do with American public opinion about the use of military force and terrorism. So here's the question. If you look at the polls over time, and frankly, if you talk to each other, we sort of sound out what we think about this matter, a lot of Americans seem to be very weary with lengthy military operations in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. Yet Americans are also supportive of military action to combat terrorism and the countries that breed and host it. So is this a contradiction in the American mind? Or is there an anti-terrorism policy that can reflect both wariness about lengthy foreign conflict, military operations in foreign lands on the one hand, and as Robert was just talking about, resolute military, swift military action to respond to terrorist incidents on the other hand? Anybody want to start us out?
Well, what John's just said is the great conundrum of American policy that goes all the way back to the founding. Americans have a schizophrenic view of foreign affairs, for foreign entanglements. I think some of the words of President Washington have been misused over the years, but it is something that we have not resolved since the 1700s. If you look at our lead into World War II, it's a remarkable example of statecraft by Franklin Roosevelt to prepare a country that had enough of high-sounding progressive nostrums about spreading democracy around the world, thanks to Mr. Wilson and the first Mr. Roosevelt, that they had to prepare for a twilight struggle against the mechanized Nazi state. I do think that we do need a renewed debate in this country about the threats that exist to our nation and to our citizens overseas. And I think that's something that this administration needs to engage in. But John also hit something that George Marshall, discussed quite a bit. He said, in a democracy, you can't sustain a conflict for more than 5 years. But that if you do have to fight, you better fight with allies, because fighting with allies is better than fighting without them. And that goes to Ambassador Cain's point, that the Western world has been leaderless, particularly for the last 8 years, and that it does require a concerted effort on our part and that of our allies to address this holistically, as opposed to the United States taking the lead. And what Ambassador Cain described as something I experienced at a debate at the Commonwealth Club in London 4 years ago, where I had to sit and listen to two salubrious members of the European Parliament discuss how the European Union had brought peace to the continent. And the moderator kept looking at me and said, "I think Mr. Wilkie has something to say." I said, "Well, I'm not a guest." "No, go ahead." I said, "Okay." I said, "I've never heard such nonsense in my life. The only reason that there has been peace in Europe in the last 50, 60 years is because 500,000 American soldiers have been in the middle of the continent keeping you all from slaughtering each other the way you have for the last 1,000 years. But John, I don't have a quick answer, but it's going to take a national debate, a national discussion. I do think we can, with the proper leadership, divorce the kinds of things that happened in Iraq from responses to terrorist states. When I see the kinds of things that happened in Iraq, we got there, and Bismarck said, "Woe be to the statesmen whose reasons for entering war are not as clear at the end as they were at the beginning." I think we found that in Iraq. I know Secretary Mattis would say that. But terrorism is a different thing. But we do have to, I think with the proper leadership, we can offer a more robust response.
Thank you. If I could add just a couple thoughts to that. History tells us that when we have a clear objective, the American people support it because we think of the timelines. If I was to ask the audience, when did World War II open and begin? We know the answer to that, 1941 and 1945. Most of us could talk about World War I, 14 to 18. If I were to ask you, when did the Vietnam War start? A little more gray in there. Most of you might get it, 60s, mid-60s, somewhere guessing there. When did it end? Mid-74, 75. The objective was no longer clear. The wars became elongated, and for many of particularly my parents who were in the Vietnam era age, that became something of a stigma, a loss, a lack of trust, a lack of breakdown. Can we trust the government to go into these places and take care of business? Is it just about defending America? Are there other components to the war that the government hasn't told us about? Last September, I believe it was, I was in a Syrian refugee camp, about 15 kilometers below the country of Syria and about 20 kilometers from Iran, there in the country of Jordan. And I remember speaking to the different families. There's about 80,000 people crammed into about a square mile that have run for their life. And through an interpreter, two families sit down and talk with me for a good while. They were aware of the red line. They were aware of how the red line had moved. And in their mindset, I guess the cultures and through their understanding, they couldn't understand why America could just pick up the phone and tell Assad, "Hey, knock it off." That was their interpretation. So whether you have these people abroad that are coming out of refugee camps, or if you're talking about our own people here, to be able to trust that the government is intact after a decade, 8 years of completely ineptness at the helm in dealing with skirmishes, dealing with Syria, dealing with North Korea. One adage real quick on Kim Jong-un. We do have a North Carolina connection. He likes to smoke about 4 packs of cigarettes a day, and he loves Johnny Walker whiskey. We do know we do know that about him. But I believe a lot of it is building back the trust of the American people. They say, "Hey, we're going in. This is our objective." The day after or the morning after that we dropped the 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles, the vice president called me and said, "Mark, let me tell you specifically, what we did. This was our objective. We took care of objective. It was very clear. And even this crazy left media, they were trying to find something to go after. The result was exactly what we wanted. We took out a good portion of their landing strip as well as their aircraft that had dropped the sarin gas. When our objective is clear, historically, the American people have always supported, and that's what we've got to get back to. So.
I'll applaud that too, by the way. I think that was a great response, Congressman. One thing I'll add is I think that Donald Trump in the last 3 months has done more to elevate the fight against ISIS and Islamic terrorism than Barack Obama did in 8 years in office. In fact, I think Barack Obama helped to create the conditions for ISIS. So I'm encouraged, John.
Another issue that was referenced in several of the opening remarks has to do with NATO. In your opinion, any of you, are the current structure, resources, and priorities of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization aligned with the interests of the U.S. at the present time? What changes, if any, should we seek in NATO and in America's role in the alliance?
I'll just start because I want to hear Robert's answer to this too. NATO has been, as with the EU and many other multilateral organizations, as in the UN and UN Security Council, a bit dysfunctional and ineffective versus its original intention. However, I'll have to say, I believe, again, thanks to the current president, we've seen significant indication in the last 3 months that countries of NATO who historically didn't ante up their fair share of the budget, who wouldn't align with us in our military posture, who wouldn't commit resources to the area we wanted to commit resources like counterterrorism, I think are getting serious. They didn't for 8 years, but now I believe they are. The defense secretaries and ministers of NATO were just in Copenhagen, oddly enough, on Tuesday, discussing this very topic, and I haven't heard reports of the meeting, Robert, maybe you have, but my impression is that there is more serious and maturity and recognition of the threat and the need for unification to fight that threat than there's been in the last decade.
Is that working or didn't
Just go.
use this one? NATO, Senator Helms, I'll go back to Senator Helms. For years, and Jimmy knows this, he would be the one voice in the Senate thundering about burden sharing, that the American taxpayer was stringing along a group of nations. When you tally up their GDP, it's 1.5 times the size of the United States. And it's ironic that after all of those years of that issue being dormant, that President Trump has picked up that theme. NATO was designed to keep, I'll paraphrase Dr. Gates, NATO was designed to keep the Soviets out and the Germans quiet, and we've exceeded beyond our wildest expectations. Germany, several of the other large powers in NATO have not shared that burden. Give you an example, when the problems in Kosovo exploded, the German army couldn't even get a brigade, which is 3,000 people, from Germany to the former Yugoslavia. Couldn't do it. We had to do it for them. I think, though, that what the ambassador said about American leadership is absolutely vital. When we lead, people do take notice. We've also seen in Europe changes in the political landscape. Sort of the sclerotic social democratic leadership in many of the European states is being washed away, and that there is a new realization amongst the center-right parties that European civilization is under threat and at stake. We have to play on that. We did precipitously withdraw from Europe to the extent that I think we have 2 brigades left. We actually have more generals in Europe than we have rifle company commanders. But I think with people like Secretary Mattis, the European nations, European leaders have confidence. Trump has done enormous work to reach out to not only the English-speaking world, United Kingdom and Canada and Australia, although obviously not part of NATO. And he's set about, I think, whether he intended, of creating different sets of alliances to buffer against failures in what has been the accepted foreign policy agenda of the United States since 1949, when NATO was kept. Being closer to the UK, being closer to Canada. So I think those are some of the realities, but we cannot, once we give our word, break it. And I'll give you the one example that I believe set Putin on his course. And I will say he has achieved incredible amounts carrying a very weak hand. I mean, the Russian economy is a basket case, and his military modernization is tied to oil being at over $100 a barrel. He's bankrupt, but because he was not resisted, he took what he could. But the minute we decided to take missile defenses out of Poland and the Czech Republic with no reciprocal deal from the Russians, Putin advanced. And we never want to be in the position that Churchill said England was in 1939, when the most ominous words in politics were too late. But I think we are starting to redress that, and I hope the Europeans have gotten the message.
Let me ask one more question, and be thinking of a question you might want to ask our panelists in just a moment. The question has to do with a very specific policy that President Trump has pursued since his inauguration. If the goal is to protect Americans from the threat of terrorism, how important is it, as the Trump administration has attempted to do, to halt, at least temporarily, immigration from certain countries where terror networks are active? It's obviously been a controversial topic. Both of the executive actions have been litigated in court. Is that the right strategy, or is there a better way to accomplish the goal of deterring terrorism in the homeland?
Thank you, John. It made me think of being in Amman last year when we sat down with it's a classified hearing, but this portion we can talk about in the sense that we asked the Secretary of State's representative there in Amman in our embassy, and we talked about the vetting. This was when this had really become a topic of conversation. What were we going to do with the vetting? State Department official who was working obviously for this previous administration told us, they said, listen, we've run the stops, we've got it taken care of, we're at a new place, we can guarantee you that our vetting is in control when it comes through here. The people that we're recommending, we've got it covered. That's about 8 or 9 o'clock that morning. 2 o'clock that afternoon, we are sitting in the Prime Minister Defense, Prince Faisal's home, personal home there in Amman, and this topic comes up again. Now, here's a country who has taken in 1 million refugees at this point, and he says, without any solicitation, he said, gentlemen, the number one problem that we have is that we can't vet these refugees from coming in our country. Now, put that together. Think about it. Here, hours earlier, the State Department is telling us they've got the vetting under control, yet the country who is responsible where these refugees are coming first are telling us that's the number one issue. We can't vet these people. We don't know where they're coming from. We don't know. What do you look up, a Transfax or TransUnion credit score? Equifax. What? The problem is that we don't. Now, I also want to say this. As Republicans, conservatives, we are engaging enough people that we can do both. So there's the point here of vetting. There's a second point of this. Doesn't mean that we're anti-Muslim. Doesn't mean that we're anti-Islam. We have a great constituents of Pakistani Muslims there in Greensboro, North Carolina, some of our biggest and most loyal supporters who, when there is something, step out and speak up, which should be happening more across the country. We can do both. We can have a proper vetting system, tighten it up to make sure the people in our country, a lot of talk here lately about, do we have a mandate to follow this agenda or Trump's agenda? Let me tell you, we have more than just a mandate. We have an oath that we take to the people that we will protect them. It's the first thing that we do in the Constitution is protect the United States citizens of America. But we do need to continue to make sure, and I believe this administration is doing a fine job of it, John, to be able to continue to vet those people. Now, with that narrative also comes the left's narrative as far as trying to pigeonhole as some kind of phobia that you may be encountering. Islamophobia, you've heard all the different things. Xenophobe is a new word. We've got to continue to message through that to be able to push back. Last thing I'll add to that, there is a different day, there's a different spirit, a different atmosphere. In visiting these Middle Eastern countries and visiting our embassies there, instead of having all these pictures and the rainbow rooms and all the different things that why can't we all just get along theme, there was already a different place of saying, hey, I'm an American citizen, and to protect the United States, protect our citizens of the United States is the most important obligation that we have. And I think that's important for each of us, I believe, to remember.
Yeah, thank you. I thought it was interesting this afternoon when Senator Tillis said that in this conversation with Jim Comey, he had learned that there were 1,000 active terror investigations, 300 of which were related to refugees. Of the cell that conducted the Paris and Brussels attacks, the leader of that cell had moved between Syria, Turkey, Pakistan, then into Belgium and Paris. I'll bet the 300 active refugee cases that Comey was referring to probably all came from 3 or 4 countries. We know who they are. We know where they're from. We don't know who they are. But the answer to the question is, John, I don't think we have a better way to do it currently. We need, however, more robust sharing of information with our allies. We need to insist that our allies, using your example, Congressman, deploy the tools that we have created to follow, track, due diligence on, and vet these people. But what President Trump said is not shut down, but it's to put a pause on the immigration from those countries until we can be darn sure we know who they are.
Yeah, I'll make a quick comment. You won't read it in the New York Times, but Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton did that very same thing. They shut off immigration and refugees from 7 countries in the Middle East. And of course, as I mentioned, the New York Times didn't report that. They used the same authorities that President Trump cited, which leads me back to my last Senator Helms story. And it was about Jimmy knows this one, it's about the New York Times. They'd written something just salacious about the senator. And I decided to write a defense. I brought it into him and he looked at it and he said, son, this is the best work you've ever done for me. But you have to understand one thing. I don't care what the New York Times says about me. So I'll leave it on that.
All right, let's see if we have any questions from the audience. Louis, you want to start us?
Yes. So thank you.
I think we have a mic coming your way. Hold on a second.
Thank you for those comments, especially, I think we're the one on committing to protecting Americans and American interests. Very important and a big change I think we'll be having now. And the clarity of purpose is always important in everything we do. Then it comes down to execution, right? The Republicans always have big, good, solid principles. And then we get to execution. When you look at where we're spending money, has a lot to do with execution. And our budget somewhere $650 billion. Let's get it, budgets take them over 10 years because that's how things those plans are. That's over $6 trillion. China's $200 billion or so. That's $4 trillion difference in 10 years. And everything is lower than that, including terrorist cells, which are even, nothing.
I don't
That's
actually
a significant.
think his voice needs amplification.
Yeah.
But we'll try it anyway.
Yeah, that's significant. That's a substantial advantage. And my question is, does it need to be that much, and are we spending it in the right places?
Let me try that one. And I don't know if I'm going to satisfy the question, but I'll say that Mark Twain said there are three types of liars: liars, damn liars, and statisticians. And the statistic that sticks out to me as a defense professional, and I always hear it, is the United States of America spends more money on defense than the next 20 nations combined. Mark Twain was right. Because if you take a look at what we spend, because the American people have decided that we are going to have an all-volunteer military, and because we have an my father entered a conscript military. In his day, only the officers had families, and maybe the senior NCOs. When he entered the military in the early 60s, I think the statistic was 11% of the 5 million Americans who were under arms then had families. So what does that mean? We had no health care, housing, spending in the armed forces of the United States. Everything went into salaries and kinetic force. Today, with a force that's about 1.8 million, I think 60-something% of the force has families. So we spend more on health care for military families than Germany spends on defense. So once you put that into the equation, the difference between what we spend and China and Russia and Iran spends gets awfully small. And we are losing our qualitative advantage. Give you an example. The last B-52 came off of the assembly line 3 months after John Kennedy was inaugurated. The grandsons of the original pilots are flying that aircraft. So, as Secretary Mattis laid out in his confirmation testimony, we have to retool. We also have to have a national debate on the composition of the military. How do we want to proceed? And it's too lengthy a debate to have here, but just give you one last factoid. 60% of the officer corps of the United States military comes from 11 states. They happen to have stars on the Confederate flag. We have entire swaths of our country, California to Washington, Washington, D.C. to Maine, that have checked out of military service. And I think that's a very dangerous trend. I mean, I'm getting off. But the answer to your question is, it isn't as clear as those numbers say. And we've got a problem, and we need to retool. So I'll stop there.
If I could just add 30 seconds to that. Thank you so much, Robert. If I can zoom out to spending as a whole, if you go back, I was born in 1969. If you go back and you looked at our budget then, think of our budget in two columns. You have mandatory spending and you have discretionary spending. You go back to 1969, the mandatory spending was about 22%. Discretionary spending was 80%. You fast forward to now, it's inverted. Mandatory spending is now up in the mid to high 70s, and you have discretionary that is trending in the 20s and dropping. Why is that important? It's where defense funding comes from, discretionary. Not only defense, education, infrastructure, really all things military, and that number keeps getting compressed. While on the mandatory side, where this entitlement growth is happening, it is blowing up. So as we talk about the terrorism and the security, it's hard to have that conversation without also talking about our fiscal irresponsibility that we have seen in this country over the last few decades. China now owns $1 trillion of our national debt. Okay, this is an issue. So when you see all this saying, well, we need to fund this, we need to fund that, this needs $1 billion, this needs a couple billion, think about that in the context of what that is doing to our military and defense. That's why it's crucial to get our spending under control.
Let's try to smuggle in one more question before we...
I'm going to segue. I actually had this question before you spoke, Secretary Wilkie, but I have something, and I understand what you're talking about, dependent expenses. That's a huge thing with our military right now. It's kind of a little bit confusing statistically to me about how you described it, but I understand what the concept is. Here's what I've got. When we fought Nazi and fascist totalitarian ideologies during World War II, roughly 50% of American families were tied directly to someone at battlefield risk. Fast forward to 2017, 1% of American families have someone tied to battlefield risk. So with only 1% of American families with skin in the game, real skin, human skin, how does that change how we engage the current totalitarian ideology, political Islam that's in front of us?
Well, let me, I failed to finish the answer to your question. The reason I brought up spending that is not kinetic is Chinese and Russians don't do that. I mean, that's it's a barbarous system.
And just total fine. Are we doing it in the right place?
Yeah, and we're not. We're not spending on the right. Mattis will tell you that. But my point is right on with you. I mean, to me, it's worse than that because we've got entire swaths of our country that have just checked out. Senator Helms used to use an example along these lines, and I actually used it in a speech at the War College. Senator Helms talked about the shared sacrifice, and he said if you go to Harvard and you go to the Harvard Memorial Chapel, and yes, they have a memorial chapel at Harvard, you see on the wall just row after row of Harvard men who died in the Civil War, Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, and Korea, and it stops. There's nothing there. Nothing in Vietnam. And Senator Helms was here for Desert Storm. Nothing there. And if he were here today, he would tell you there's nothing for Afghanistan and Iraq. And he would also tell you that that's a very disturbing thing, that people who consider themselves to be the best and the brightest do not participate. And now there's some sociologists who will tell you that people like me who've served or serving because I come from a line of soldiers, it's no different from a lawyer who's following in his dad's footsteps, or the grocer or the banker or the doctor who've done what parents and grandparents have done. But I think when you're talking about national security, you run the risk when you don't engage the entire public in service to the country. One political party doesn't care and the other takes those in uniform for granted. And I think it can lead to bad decisions, indifference when it comes to, it disturbed me when I worked in the National Security Council. Many of my colleagues, younger colleagues, were very flippant in describing, it was like pins on a map. The 82nd goes here, and as it was some bloodless Princeton debate. So what you're saying is, I don't know the answer to it, but it is disturbing.
Well, ladies and gentlemen,